Oh, and good morning, all of my world history students. I hope today is off to a great start and you had a good time using some colored pencils to complete your choropleth maps. I look forward to seeing those when I'm back on Monday and maybe using them to add a little life to our walls of our classroom. We'll decorate our room with those. All right, so this video is just a little introduction to our very first topic in Unit 3 and what you'll do the rest of the day today to get started learning about China on the Silk Roads. Just a heads up that tonight you should start working on your Unit 3 maps, which are the first 3 pages of your new workbook. We've got some new locations to cover as we get into the Silk Roads. All right, if you haven't already, grab your workbook and turn to page 12. So press pause if you need to and meet me right back here. Okay, so just a little quick introduction to the Silk Roads, which we did a little bit of yesterday, but a little bit more on what we're learning about in this third unit of the year. So we've looked at the map of the Silk Roads briefly yesterday, but I want to look at it a little bit more in depth and talk about how we're going to cover this chapter, so the Unit 3 overview. Basically, we're going to travel the Silk Roads starting today in China in the modern city of Xi'an, where under the Han Dynasty, these trade routes begin to form and are protected by the government. And as we move to the west, we'll take a stop in India, looking at the formation of the first unified empires in the Indian subcontinent and a huge middleman of the Silk Roads. Continuing westward, we'll take a look at Central Asia and the Middle East and the rise of Islam and Islamic civilization. Continuing west, we'll go to North Africa. And then finally, we'll wind up back in Europe in their dark ages, where the rest of the Silk Roads is flourishing. But we'll see how they pull themselves out of the dark ages. So in other words, we start in East Asia, we then head to India, then the Middle East, North Africa, and loop back around to Europe to see what they've been up to since the fall of the Roman Empire. So that means the focus of today and tomorrow is East Asia on the Silk Roads, and in particular, China. Before we start getting into China, a few concepts that we're going to be talking about a lot throughout this unit that we should review. The first one is cultural diffusion. This is a word we talk about a lot in world history, and we've defined it before, but a review. The spreading, blending, and mixing of cultures that occurs through contact between two civilizations, usually through trade or war. So we're going to see a lot of cultural diffusion happening between these civilizations of the Eastern Hemisphere as the Silk Roads join them commercially. And we see cultural diffusion all around the world today. So just a few examples. You can probably recognize this ad in all these different languages. But this is what cultural diffusion does with this case example of Coca-Cola. It spreads products and ideas around the world that are modified and adapted for local culture. So it creates cultural mixing. We have already seen an example of this in history, the example of Hellenism. So as Alexander the Great built his empire and conquered the Persian Empire, we get the blending of Greek and Persian culture. So we're going to see a lot more examples like this as we span the Silk Roads in Unit 3. Another thing that we're going to see is a major force behind cultural diffusion is the spread of religion. We're going to look at 3 religions this unit, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam. 2 of those 3, the first 2, are religions born in the Indian subcontinent that spread along the Silk Roads. And then finally, Islam, a religion of the Middle East that also spreads very widely along the Silk Roads. And you can see in these maps how these religions are spreading east and west from the center of the Silk Roads. So religion is another good example of cultural diffusion. We'll look at how that plays out in architecture in particular. Another really key concept, one that we touched on yesterday as we were building our maps of the modern Silk Roads, is globalization. So Unit 3 can be thought of as the first era of globalization, where civilizations across the Eastern Hemisphere become unified in a single economic system. And globalization is simply the global interconnectedness of trade and commerce. It provokes cultural diffusion. Nowadays, since our global economy is truly global, both Eastern and Western Hemisphere, we have a lot of cultural diffusion. I wanted to give you one example of how globalization can be a really fun, cool thing, and that's through food. So a lot of the foods that span Eastern Hemisphere civilizations have been influenced by civilizations linked by the Silk Roads. So, for example, one really important one is tea culture. All along the Silk Roads, tea is a really important drink, not only because it is delicious and warm, but also it was key to negotiating and doing business between merchants on the Silk Roads. And even if you think about the word tea in different languages, whether it's chai or cha, or matcha, green tea, those words are common throughout languages spoken across the Silk Roads or modified. Another fun one is dumplings. I mean, how fun is that? Are you hungry? I'm so hungry looking at this. But civilizations across the Silk Roads, all the way from China to the Mediterranean, the Italian peninsula, have their own form of dumplings. Noodles. Noodles are a food that emerges in China and spreads all along the Silk Roads, coming to be Italian pasta in the Mediterranean. And flatbread, that makes sense, right? So people traveling along the Silk Roads would pack flatbread everywhere. And across the Eastern Hemisphere, we see cultures emerging with their own version of flatbread. So food's a really cool way that things spread on the Silk Roads. And this map shows us, and these lists at the bottom show us all the other things besides food that's spreading along the Silk Roads, going west to east and east to west. Obviously, a really important one being silk. So, not surprisingly, most of you guys in doing your group work yesterday, compiling your data from your closets, realized that China is still a major supplier of goods in the global economy, this globalized economy of the 21st century. So it kind of makes sense to start there, the origins of the Silk Roads. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of what China was up to on the Silk Roads and the dynasties that emerged, you're going to take a peek at an Italian perspective on what was going on in China and the Silk Roads. So here you are on page 12. You're going to read the account of a really famous traveler of the Silk Roads, or supposedly a traveler of the Silk Roads. He wrote this book of marvels, Marco Polo, and supposedly it's an account of his travels that you can see in this map, going all the way from Venice in Italy, essentially across the Eastern Hemisphere to China over land, and then taking a sea route back home. So as you're reading this account, there's some questions at the end to answer, but you want to think about, what does Marco Polo teach us about Chinese society, economics, government, infrastructure? So what do we know about China on the Silk Roads as a result of his account? Based on the descriptions that he gives us of Chinese civilizations, what can we infer about his civilization? So what are the things that he's really marveling at, and what does that tell us about the world he lives in? And also, thinking about this account from a historical lens, does it strike you as reliable? Why or why not? This is a question that you're going to come back to at the end of class tomorrow after you've done more learning about China on the Silk Roads. All right, so your final step today, as you could see on pages 12 and 13, you've got that primary source. With your groups, first read the italicized background information at the top of page 12, then the primary source, and answer those 3 questions that follow on page 13. And then don't forget to start your Unit 3 maps for homework tonight. All right, have a great time.